The Friday Power Lunch is recorded before a live Zoom audience. The Friday Power Lunch. Badass women getting things done.
There is nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do about it. The time to do something about it was November 2024. The only option we have at this juncture is that you make sure Republicans no longer hold the majority in the House and the Senate November of this year.
If
Okay,
that
that was
didn't get you
fantastic.
going, right?
Yeah. So
My
what
God.
an ode to June, to Gay Pride Month, right? So this is fantastic. I want to be Diana Ross or RuPaul. It doesn't really matter. I'll take either one.
I
was
think,
great.
well, it makes you feel like you really can survive. I don't know. Disco can do that to you. I don't know if it's the extra Coke or what it is, but it really does make you feel up and you're going. And I have my disco. I wear like a
I
little.
see.
Oh,
This
yeah.
is awesome.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I tell you, had I known it was the disco, I should have previewed it because I have disco ball earrings, and that would have made the show, in my opinion.
Yeah, that would have been
I
good.
do think it's really appropriate that we had this right now because Taylor and I were in Paris for the last couple of Friday Power Lunches, and we went to the Museum of Paris. Like it's the history of Paris, and it goes through all of the revolutions and all of the republics and what they went through up and down, up and down. Some of them only, some regimes only lasted like 6 years. And I promise you that I came out of that feeling more uplifted. I had a new appreciation for what I studied in history. I'm so glad we're talking about history today. But at the end of the day, I was thinking, oh my gosh, you know what? They've been through it. We've really not really in 250 years. So I guess we're kind of due. And all of a sudden, I didn't feel so bad that our republic lasted 250 years. And we're going to see what comes next. I felt a little better.
Well, hopefully we can skip the guillotine and some other bullshit like the guillotines and all that head on the stakes and that really fun stuff. Thomas Jefferson sort of was like, yes, that French Revolution. Well, we saw it in the Civil War and we saw it in different places. So you're right. With that said, I am excited to have set up today because when we talked about what the influencer bell curve, I thought of Fennell, and when you heard Bell talk about the midterms, and she's like, "Black people tried to tell you," and on and on and on. What was your reaction to this?
I was laughing. I was laughing out loud, and I'm going to put it on my nugget with the QR code so that people can actually see and hear her because it's exactly what I say. I say to you guys, I don't care about nothing. Nothing. What you got to do to get to November 3rd, 2026. That is the North Star. Period. End of story.
Yeah, I mean, I think people get stuck in all this other stuff because it is where the media leads us, which actually the political party infighting leads us, is to take your eye off the ball. And the one thing we have to focus on is really how do we secure a democracy, hold people accountable. And when we were talking to Paul Quigley in the pre-chat about political violence and the history of it, one thing we all agree on how important accountability is, or how important when we talk about laws or decorum. So I don't know if you guys have a response to that.
Well, we've definitely seen all the MAGA folks disregarding decorum, on the regular. I think what's resonating with us right now is the power that we have, at least in the short term, to say that, people are losing their freedoms all over because of this regime, but we are taking action to protect 3 important freedoms in our state right now, and that in Virginia. And it makes us feel like we can do something that will protect us from the chaos in DC. At least we know, we have trigger laws that would take rights away immediately if we change regimes. So I think it's a good idea that we are having something tangible where we know we can work really hard on these 3 amendments to the Constitution.
So to set that up for people that don't know, we have 3 constitutional amendments for the midterms on November 3rd, Virginia. If you're here from a different state, different states will have different drivers, but I think we're very unique on that. And I think it helps us right now, folks in the room looking for work to do, not focusing on candidates, because we talked about this before. Our primary is August 4th. And so our candidates are in a primary. So not all of them, but the grassroots people in this room could start writing for amendments. And I know, Fennell, why don't you talk about that action you're doing? And I know Cova Coalition is doing some stuff too.
Well, I'm not sure which action, but I'll tell you about all three of them. So this is why I'm asking Laura every day to please send me those zines, because the zine is a little baby booklet. And I
Yes.
just
Oh,
think
yes.
the little baby booklet with the three amendments on it would just be something really, really easy to pass out so that people can understand
Right.
fully. Because if you say yes, this is again, this is about saying yes. But the other thing, which you all know I work on, is nuggets, nuggets that really sort of speak to the moment. And I've done something a little different with the nuggets this time. They actually are custom nuggets.
That's the nuggets. And they're
They're,
the
they're,
little cards,
they're
when you
little. I
say
thought I
nuggets.
had one. I don't have one to show you, but they're custom nuggets. And so this one of them says, "I'm pissed, and you should be too." And then on the back of it, it tells you what you should be mad about, and it's been really funny. And then the second one that I'm working on says, "Damn it, give me back my rights," and it's about restoring your rights. And so it's
That's
just
perfect.
really to get people interested, like they want to see why. And this is really all of this sort of unexpected. But I wanted to go back to you when you were talking about what should we be focused on. And I want to say this is why I think the discussion with Paul Quigley is going to be so important today, is that we really need to understand history. This is why we're where we are, because they have made it really difficult for people to understand how we got where we are. And so, however the story needs to be told, we need to be able to tell a full story quickly, but powerfully and passionately about what's happening. So that's what I think is important. And I think the discussion today will help get us there, both of the discussions.
Yeah. Carrie, what's your thinking about all this?
Just drop something. Yeah, just drop something in the chat. Cova Coalition has
Yep.
already developed a web page that we can send our friends to give them more information about the actual language of the three ballot initiatives. We are also developing a campaign called
Oh,
Three Amendments, One Ballot. We have plans. We're working on the artwork right now. Our first trifold brochure is now in our hot
nice.
little hands to distribute this Sunday at Pride in the Peak for Chesapeake.
Yay.
And we're working on our palm cards, stickers, post-it notes for doors, billboards, yard signs, and
What?
visibility brigade efforts with our messaging. And we
Where's
are
the
on it,
bell?
friends.
We
We
need
are
it.
on it, friends.
We need some
Yeah,
applause, Robin, for this
yeah,
transition for sure. Get that ready. And let
really
me just
excited.
say that activists in the room are democracy lovers. This is the creativity that we bring to the work. So this kind of stuff, to look at the websites, to add to your work, the billboards, the same messaging, and going after not this, vote for this candidate. It has to be more translatable. We are really thinking the answer to a lot of this stuff, and we're talking about the historian today, and we have Delegate Dan Helmer here as well, and Cheryl Smith, a former candidate, is really making really engaging people and being civically active to start to engage them more into their society, into their local communities, and really locals where it's at. So with that said, I want to get us started on time. I'm so glad you're in the room today. If you hopefully you got to dance in to I Will Survive. If not, we'll disco out at the end. But welcome. It's June 12th and you're on the Power Lunch. And we are the grassroots organization that works across the nation to bring fun to everybody, to bring knowledge and bring us to make politics more fun. So we're glad you're in the room. The rules of the road, we have the chat. We let ours open. Why not? We want you to talk. In fact, tell us what you're working on right now or some of your concerns. We'd love to hear what's on your mind. But if you get really nasty, we'll kick you out. The gals in the back in the room, they pretty much have they have a radar, let's just say. So just be nice and share. After chat, stick with us after 1 p.m. This is where things get good. And if our guests can stay, I can tell you Dana Gold was here from the Government Accountability a couple weeks ago, and we learned so much in the after chat because really discussions go deeper and further. We don't record that though. That is really a really unique part of our show. Speaking of our show, the patrons today get some. If you become a patron today, you get a Friday Power Lunch mug. Woo! Look at that. And I drink out of mine every day. It's very special. But we definitely would love to have more patrons. We need the support. It really helps us. Thank you to our patrons in the room. And then remember to support our show, subscribe to our Substack. You'll get such great content. And if you don't subscribe, then it's hard to see all the stuff that Fennell's writing and I'm writing and we're producing. And then, of course, we have our live show. So we'd love to see you for that. Today's show, we have Paul Quigley here, author of The Man Behind the Cane. Delegate Dan Helmer will be here, Virginia House of Delegates, Army veteran and gun safety advocate. And we'll do a big plus. Carrie Shorts back with her foot in a boot, but her mouth will be all right. It wasn't injured, so we're good.
Thank God.
Thank God. Big 10 Women's Summit Spotlight with candidate Cheryl Smith. Oh, we're so excited to talk about that. So with that, I would love to get this party started. Thank you, ladies, and let's roll. Fennell, you were on with your first guest. You can introduce.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to say welcome to Paul Quigley, the author of The Man Behind the Cane. And if you guys will bring him up, I can't wait to talk about this. The Man Behind the Cane, Preston Brooks, Political Violence and the Road to the Civil War. So let's get started. What I'd love for you to do is just to open up and tell them a little bit about yourself and why you decided to write this book. And then we'll talk specifically about this man behind the cane, Preston Brooks.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. So I'm a history professor at Virginia Tech, specialize in Civil War era history. So I have long been familiar with that iconic moment of American political history, the caning of Charles Sumner, which took place in May 1856. And it's depicted on the book cover there. You've got it in your background. I'll show an even closer view there. For most people, once they see that picture, they know what we're talking about. The context was the big conflict over slavery that ultimately led to the Civil War. And Charles Sumner was an abolitionist senator from Massachusetts. He gave an anti-slavery speech in the Senate, and Preston Brooks, the man behind the cane, was a South Carolina congressman who decided that Sumner's abolitionism warranted this physical response. So I have long been aware of this incident and wanted to know more about it in a way that other historians have not tended to do. So I wanted to know who Preston Brooks was, why he did this, but maybe even more importantly, what the consequences were for American political culture of this drastic, radical act of violence taking place on the floor of the United States Senate. And the result is the book.
So this is really fascinating for people to sort of visualize this actual thing happening. So you would think that after someone beat someone within an inch of their life on the Senate floor, that there would be repercussions and that he'd go back and people would say, what a horrible person you are. But what actually happened when he went back?
Yeah, there were certainly many Americans who did say exactly that, what a horrible person you are, and how could we allow this to happen in our politics? But there were also a lot of white Southerners in particular, as well as sympathizers in the North, who took the opposite tack and supported what Brooks did, felt it was justified, argued that because Sumner's rhetoric had been so radical, so he'd spoken out against slavery time after time, he also hurled some personal insults at various political enemies, including one of Preston Brooks's relatives, which is a big part of the reason Brooks decided to act. So for a lot of people in the South who were interested in defending slavery, they didn't want to give abolitionists a platform or the ability to share their ideas. They felt that the violence was justified, and this was one of those moments that forced people to line up on one side or the other.
Which brings us to the fact of the kind of insults that were hurled. And what I found so interesting as I was going through the book is the fact that we don't really talk about it today in ways that people would really understand viscerally what slavery was all about, the way that they beat people. And people sort of were thinking, well, wow, if he treats another human being, a white person like this, how on earth must he treat the slaves that he had? But let's go a little bit further and talk about language here and words here and how they played a part to actually getting us where we are today.
Yeah, the language side of things is really fascinating because, of course, it was a speech that prompted this act of violence, and supporters of Sumner made the point, we have free speech in this country, particularly for a senator. There's that clause in the Constitution, the speech and debate clause, which pretty much gives an added layer of protection to congressmen who are speaking in debates. So supporters of Sumner made the point, look, even if you don't like what he said, he has the right to say it, particularly in a Senate speech. And for slaveholders and their sympathizers, because they did have a lot of sympathizers in the North at the time, they felt that fair enough, free speech is fine to a certain point. But if you're saying something that's so egregious, so extreme, then the protections of free speech no longer apply. And one of the really important things they didn't want people to talk about was slavery, and they didn't want to hear abolitionist language.
So interestingly enough, they thought if the language was appropriate, and some of the language that Charles Sumner used to describe slavery, he was like, "You're treating it like a harlot, like a," and he was, and he talked about the rape of the women, and so these were things that they were actually doing, but they didn't want to hear it said out loud.
Yeah, I think Sumner really knew which buttons to push, and he used a variety of euphemisms for sexual violence, and some of them not so euphemistic, but very
Mhm.
easy to decode. And you're absolutely right that this was an area that really set off the sensitivities of Southern slaveholders because they knew this was something that did happen, and they did not want to hear about it.
So I want to just talk a little bit about the consequences of his actions in terms of what happened. And really, I want to think about the violence and how we think about violence today. January 6th, for example, all of the violence that happened, but we see that being rewritten today right before our eyes. So talk a little bit about the violence then and sort of how that sort of, takes us where we are today.
Yeah, and it's important to note, I think this wasn't a completely isolated incident. In fact, there's a really great book by a historian named Joanne Freeman, The Field of Blood, and she explores dozens of incidents of violence in Washington, D.C. in the decades leading up to the Civil War. So this kind of thing, anyway, is happening fairly regularly. But what made the caning distinctive and what made it have such an impact was, first of all, I think the severity of the attack. It only lasted about a minute, but Preston Brooks left Charles Sumner unconscious briefly at the end of it with head lacerations down to the bone. So this is a really, really serious attack. But even more so, the location is what a lot of people disagreed with. So there's a lot of violence going on, but this is an exceptional act of violence that really gets people talking in a way that they weren't before.
Yeah, and so one of the things that happened, I know that people gave him gifts. Some of them sent him canes to replace the one that he had. I want you to sort of, as you were sort of researching all of this, because you spent some time there, you spent some time in South Carolina. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the vibe of the people there, because we sort of feel like this whole era, the slavery, the movement to abolish slavery, Jim Crow, it sort of feels like all of these things, did they really ever leave the South? Or as you were there doing your research, did you really feel like, this stuff it's not gone, it never left? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I think this history still shapes the region. I think the region has also changed an awful lot, even since the time I've been doing historical research there. But one thing that sort of illustrates that change, I think, is that when I first started in the history business, I was interested in the history of South Carolina and the South in general. And so one of the places I've been going to do research for about 20, maybe 20 plus years at this point is the University of South Carolina. And they've got a library where they've got their archives, they've got a lot of rare books and that kind of thing. So it's one of those places you go if you're researching this topic. And when I first started going there, actually 25 years ago now, you would walk up the stairs to the reading room in the library, and there was a plaque on the stair next to the stairs in honor of Preston Brooks. So the perpetrator of this caning was being honored by a plaque in the library I was going to do research. And the plaque had been there, since the early to mid 20th century. So it'd been there a while, It felt like an anachronism increasingly over the last few years. And, the reason I say I think the region has changed a lot is when they renovated the library, they did not replace the plaque. I think, the people who were responsible for that saw that we were past time for change where somebody who did something like that should be venerated in that very public way.
I wanted to also ask you about Ham, who was Preston Brooks's brother. And if you would just talk a little bit, because we will talk about Charles Sumner, because I think it's something to be said about him too, and how he was feeling about this decades later in terms of what he wanted, what he thought should be done. But talk a little bit about Preston Brooks, really sort of as a failed man. I sort of compare him to Pete Hegseth, but that's another story. But talk about that, and then talk about his brother Ham and how he talked about him when Charles Sumner actually did. There was a book written about him.
Yeah, so different people, of course, had different perceptions of Preston Brooks all along. And after the caning in particular, he became a symbol to a lot of people. Certainly within his family, he was celebrated. His younger brother, Ham, was significantly younger than him, but he wrote him a letter right after the caning, celebrating what he did. If I can help or support you in any way, let me know, this kind of thing. And then years later, I don't really know much more about Ham, but there's an episode years later after the Civil War when Preston Brooks's reputation was being kind of maligned in the national press, and Ham, his younger brother, wrote letters to newspapers trying to defend his brother's reputation. So, within that close family network, Brooks was celebrated. And when it came to Sumner, Sumner didn't really say too much at the time, honestly. He didn't, do what you might expect him to do and come out swinging rhetorically. I think he recognized that Brooks's actions said everything that needed to be said. And when he was an older man in the 1870s, there was a report that Sumner had said that he was ready to forgive Preston Brooks and move on. So he showed some kind of conciliation towards the end of his life.
So let's talk a little bit about this book, and let's see what we can sort of do for comparisons to where we are today. And when you and I were chatting, I was like, well, tell me anything that you think we can sort of learn and think about moving forward today. Because this really is, this takes us to the Civil War. And this is how this was a conversation that we were unable to have. These people, this violence occurred because they wanted to hold on and they were unable to have a conversation about it. What does it tell us today about what we're seeing, and what lessons might we learn?
Yeah, I think there are really important lessons, and for the most part, honestly, they align really well with what experts on present day political violence anywhere would tell us. So things like the fact that political violence has a toxic effect on democratic politics. Maybe we don't need the lessons of the 1850s to understand that. That should be obvious, I think. But I think looking at the caning and the reactions to it really drives that home. So political violence is toxic to democratic politics. It also tends to drive people apart. You would hope that acts of spectacular political violence like this would kind of create a moment where people would say, hold on a minute, this has gone too far. We need to do better. We need to figure out a way to get past this. But in fact, more often, and certainly in 1856, this is what happened. It drove people further apart. And even people who were sort of ambivalent about the caning itself felt like they had to take sides and line up on the pro-slavery or the anti-slavery side, as the case may be. And I think that's another big lesson of the caning. The other one, the final one that I'll mention is just, and again, this is something that commentators today are saying left, right, and center all the time. We have to expect our leaders and kind of hold our leaders to a high standard when it comes to responses to political violence. There's no wiggle room here. Political leaders have to say in the 1850s or today that this is unacceptable. Otherwise, that downward spiral is likely to continue.
So what do you think about I was talking earlier when we were opening the show about the stories that we tell and trying to be truthful about the stories. And as you were doing your research, and you actually got to tour, and tell me what you saw other than the plaque that just sort of spoke to you and made you think about something perhaps differently, or made you think differently about how you might have a conversation with someone about what happened during this caning.
Yeah, when I was doing the research, I did try and spend time in Edgefield, which was Preston Brooks's hometown, and get a feel for the place. And that material didn't make it into the book because I don't really feel like I developed a keen sense of what people there today are thinking about Preston Brooks and how they reflect on the memory. Kind of indirect vibes I get is that the huge majority of people would not want to celebrate Preston Brooks today. But I think there's probably still that kind of fringe element that would see what he did as a good thing, maybe. But again, I didn't really, that wasn't my goal in talking to people and going there to do the research. So I didn't really get a sense of how prevalent that attitude is.
Yeah. So as I'd love for you to think about the lost cause, how we tell stories today, and how these stories have moved forward. How did you think about that as you were doing this book?
Yeah, the Lost Cause makes an appearance in the epilogue to the book.
Hmm.
And it's a fairly short epilogue, gives a fairly brief, kind of high level look over the last 170 years of how Preston Brooks has been remembered. And one of the themes there is that the way he's been remembered has kind of tracked the evolution of Civil War memory more generally. So throughout much of the 20th century, the lost cause was prevalent. The idea that the Confederacy was this noble cause, that the war wasn't about slavery, and so on and so forth. And into that kind of general view of history fit a sort of positive-ish image of Preston Brooks. Maybe not to the extent that, oh, we wish there was someone doing this again, but to the extent at least that he wasn't a bad actor in history. So I think his memory has sort of tracked the broader changes in the memory of the Civil War and slavery.
My final question, when you were doing the research for this book and you were having discussions with people, and you had discussions with a lot of people, did you hear something that you were surprised to hear, that you thought, geez, I can't believe people either feel that way or think that way or understand things that way? Because that's what I'm wondering is, in the South, and anybody who carries a Confederate flag, like, do
Mm.
they really understand what that is saying? We have schools that are still named after Confederate generals who were really protecting the ability to keep people enslaved. Now, the lost cause tells a different story, but we know that. Were you surprised for certain things that you heard?
I think the thing that surprised me when I first started working on this book, which was a long time ago, about 12 years ago, or 13, and so when I would be telling people what topic.
Or the Senate, where you beat the crap out of somebody, and the ability to go into the Capitol and beat the crap out of police officers and then be pardoned and then be a part of a slush fund. So history does inform us that we have not moved on.